be English. So in case somebody speaks in Spanish, then you have that immediate interpretation into English. The feature is not active yet, but once it's active, if you're joining with a computer, you will see a globe at the bottom of your screen. Select that globe and select English. If you're joining with a cell phone or a tablet or an iPad, your options may be a bit different. You need to tap your screen and find the menu with the three dots either on top or at the bottom of your screen. Select a language interpretation, select English, and very important at the end to select Done. If you need any help once the feature is active, please let us know and we can we can help you activate your feature. I apologize for that. Thank you so much. We can start interpretation now.
Thank you so much, Tanya and Diana. I am going to start interpretation now with Tanya. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Neha Sangera, and I'm the Policy Director at the Berkeley Food Institute. BFI is the Policy Research and Education Institute housed in UC Berkeley. We leverage UC resources in partnership with communities to shape a just food and farm system. Today's webinar kicks off our spring webinar series where we connect policy and research to explore key issues shaping our food and farming system. The best way to stay up to date on the topics we will be covering in our future webinars is to subscribe to the BFI newsletter. And now for today's webinar on farmworker experiences working during wildfires. Climate change is increasing the frequency and duration of wildfires across California. In fact, the number of acres burned annually has roughly doubled over the past 4 decades. Farm workers are among the most climate-exposed workers in the country. They work outdoors, often for long hours, with limited availability to control their work conditions. In California, this workforce is predominantly Latino, largely immigrant, and as we'll hear today, facing economic circumstances so precarious that many feel they simply cannot afford to stop working, even when there's a fire nearby, or when the air quality is hazardous, or when there's evacuation orders in effect. And as wildfires in California grow more and more frequent and intense, the state's policy responses are evolving too. The safety and economic needs to protect California's livestock and agricultural industry and operations is urgent and growing. New legislation, new county programs, and new questions about who has access to evacuation zones and under what conditions are emerging across the state. Sonoma County's AgPass program is one of the most expansive of these programs. In 2021, California passed Assembly Bill 1103, detailing how livestock operators and owners can re-enter evacuation zones for essential duties during active wildfire. Some counties, like Sonoma County, expanded eligibility beyond livestock to include agriculture and to include activities like irrigating and harvesting crops. This means that we're now authorizing agricultural workers to re-enter evacuation zones to labor in conditions that could potentially be hazardous with hazardous levels of wildfire smoke. This raises questions like, what are the experiences of those working in these conditions, and are our policies adequately serving them? These are precisely the questions that today's panelists set out to answer through their evaluation of the Sonoma County AgPass program, which, by the way, engaged over 1,000 farm workers as a part of the study. Linda Gordon is the supervising attorney of the Investigations Lab and a climate researcher at the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley. She coordinates the center's research on human impacts of extreme weather and environmental hazards made more severe by climate change. Carly Hyland is an assistant professor of cooperative extension in environmental health sciences and UC-ANR, whose work focuses on mitigating the health effects of climate change among agricultural and food system workers. Zeke Guzman is the president of Latinos Unidos del Condado de Sonoma. Zeke has dedicated his life to advocacy for farm worker and low-income communities. For over 45 years, he has worked to help people attain living wages, affordable housing, and vocational training. Welcome, Carly, Zeke, and Linda. We're so excited to have you. Before we get started on your presentation, one quick note, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So audience members tuning in, please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And you don't have to wait until the end of the webinar. You can go ahead and submit your questions as the panelists are presenting. So with that, I will turn it over to Linda. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to be here with all of you. I am seeing, it looks like there's like a double layer of the presentation screen shared right now. Oh,
just one sec. Of course, we practice this, and then once you actually do it, it is always different.
That looks good to me.
great. Oh, yes, I see. Okay, great. Thanks so much. So wildfires are occurring with increasing severity and regularity in California. And these fires have enormous impacts on people's lives, both short and long-term effects. And for today's topic, we really see how fires can immediately force people into difficult choices if their work and livelihood are immediately put in potential harm's way. So the Human Rights Center began work in 2023 to assess farm workers' experiences in wildfire evacuation zones amidst policy developments that were occurring at the state and county levels regarding access inside evacuation zones for work. And early on, we focused on Sonoma County because it had unfortunately experienced significant fires. It had an Ag Pass program that was going into effect that really referenced both its own county requirements and built on the state requirements, which we were interested in studying. And it also has a large agriculture and farm worker communities that have had to contend with fires during times of great economic significance, such as harvest. The county has also been a leader in creating robust infrastructure for emergency response, particularly since the Tubbs fire in 2017. And when we began our research, the county was among the first to be creating a formal Ag Pass program based on AB 1103, which I'm going to discuss. Just a note to say that we partnered, yes, I can slow down. We partnered with Carly and Zeke, who've really taken this work to a whole new level and led the community engagement team and health survey, which will be the bulk of what we talk about today. And these survey results directly informed all of our policy and legal analysis, and really inform our understanding of how the laws of emergencies go into effect, how evacuation zones are regulated, and where gaps in protections exist. So getting us started with kind of the legislation that really provided the foundation for our research, AB 1103 was signed in 2021 and required going into effect in 2023, representing the first state legislation to alter evacuation zone access for livestock pass programs. And the bill directed counties to implement specific criteria like wildfire safety training requirements when creating livestock pass programs that allow livestock owners or managerial employees access inside evacuation zones for limited activities at the discretion of a public safety officer. The bill specifically amends the Agricultural Code, the Health and Safety Code, and the Penal Code. And notably, when the language was passed, it was just applicable to livestock owners and managerial employees. There was no mention of agriculture or full-time employees in the bill. And in fact, the text had been amended during the legislative process, so agriculture had been mentioned in an earlier form, but it was not included in the final bill that passed. And looking at the bill's history, there was no analysis done by any public health or labor agencies regarding the impact that the bill's passage would have on these departments or the enforcement of health and safety or labor within an evacuation zone, which the bill amended. So the bill, while originally focused on livestock pass programs, has been built upon by several counties to be implemented in a range of ways. Some counties have just passed livestock pass programs, others have passed more comprehensive Ag Pass programs, and that's the focus of our research and the discussion today. So the Sonoma Ag Pass program, as previously mentioned, we focused on our research starting in 2023, But the county did have an ad hoc form of ag pass systems in place prior to this that were used during the Glass and the LMU complex fires. And these ag passes were issued by the Ag Commissioner's Office, and they had a different set of criteria. The passes were not standardized for one pass per one individual, but rather administered in different ways. And then in 2022, the Board of Supervisors began the process of forming a committee to ultimately create a formal Ag Pass program, which was explicitly referencing the implementation of AB 1103 and the county's own authority. And this is significant for today's discussion because the Sonoma specific Ag Pass program expands eligibility to full-time workers and includes agricultural work purposes as allowed to receive a pass. And the sheriff is granted full discretion under the county's program to lead the administration of the pass program with support from the Ag Commissioner's Office and to activate the Ag Pass. And then in 2023, the Sonoma program was explicitly amended to allow harvesting as an authorized activity, which was of particular note for us because it now meant that we were studying a program which had specifically authorized full-time workers access to evacuation zones potentially for harvest. A quick overview of how the program works. An application is submitted by an individual. So now each person has to receive their own Ag Pass in order to be eligible. The person submits their application to the Agricultural Commissioner's Office. And this includes the submission of required criteria, such as the completion of the wildfire safety training. And also for full-time employees requires that they have received an authorizing letter from their employer indicating that they are eligible and allowed to sign up for the Ag Pass program. And then approved applications are sent to the sheriff's office. And the sheriff then either takes a photo or the folks can submit a photo online. And then people go in person to receive their Ag Pass from the sheriff's office. And then the program is essentially dormant until a wildfire evacuation goes into effect. And at that point, that an evacuation zone is activated and all individuals inside a mandatory evacuation zone must leave the area. And the Ag Pass, if activated, allows people to re-enter the evacuation zone to perform one of the specific critical activities that the Ag Pass authorizes, including irrigating crops and harvest. And to re-enter using an Ag Pass, an individual must go to a checkpoint that is set up by the sheriff's office, but often run by a mutual aid partner such as California Highway Patrol or the National Guard, or another agency that the sheriff is working with for the fire response. And so the person is interacting, showing their identification to the law enforcement or relevant officer, and then authorized to re-enter. And the pass includes specific provisions around when a person is allowed to re-enter the evacuation zone and that they must evacuate through the same route that they came in, and that they're supposed to exit by nightfall, and that employers are supposed to be collecting information about each individual with an Ag Pass that is re-entering or exiting the evacuation zone. But in practice, we did learn that there was no system in place to collect this information from employers. And in response to records requests, the sheriff said that there was no process for collecting this information.
Linda, I think this slide was you, but with all of this, the kind of objectives of this work were to evaluate the implications of the Ag Pass on farm worker health, physical safety, economic security, and data privacy. This could be a whole days long section. And so for this webinar, we're really going to focus on health and economic security and kind of present our findings looking at potential gaps in farm workers and protection for wildfires, whether or not it's specifically under the Ag Pass, working in a wildfire evacuation zone, or also just working during wildfires more largely. And then we also are going to present just a few kind of county and state recommendations that we developed to improve health and safety for farm workers. We do have a whole white paper, though, that goes into recommendations for all 4 areas of focus. And then we also wanted to note that we did surveys with farm workers directly for this project, which Zeke will talk a little bit more about. We also did key informant interviews with a lot of different stakeholders, including the Board of Supervisors, various different county departments, state agencies, and community-based organizations. And again, we go into a lot more detail about all of those in our publications, but today we're really focusing on the survey with farm workers. So I'll hand it over to Zeke now to talk about that.
Thank you for inviting me, Carly, and to be part of this discussion. I think it's really important that the people that are impacted the most have a voice in what is being studied, on their life experience, the impact they have on their lives. And, I always say there's 3 determinants of health: a job, food, and housing. And if you take a look at what the impact wildfire has on farm worker, it impacts all 3 areas. When I was asked to put together an engagement team to survey out, farm workers, I looked for trusted messengers in the community. Okay, these are people that have been out in the community, loading food, distributing food at food banks, responding to family emergencies, responding to health needs, food needs. And these are the people that when you go interview them and talk to them about this survey, they're already trusted in the community, because we asked over 50 questions. Okay, so we assembled a team of incredible people, which it's here on the slide. And what we did was, but before we started to survey people, it was important that farm workers have a voice in the development of the survey. So what we did was we formed a committee of farm workers, and we actually reviewed the survey with them. Were we asking for the information that really has impacted their lives during wildfires? And I think it was incredible, the insights that they had as to how their lives were impacted, and they had a say in the development of the survey, number one, which was critical. But also, why Latinos Unidos? Why were we asked? Because we're an organization that responds to situations like wildfires in our community. And I'll just share, for example, during the 2019 Kincaid fire, we were informed that there were over 350 farm workers in a small community of Cloverdale. They had no services whatsoever. They all gathered there because it was a safe place to show up to. But there were no services, there was no food, there was Office of Emergency Services weren't there, the American Red Cross was not there, nobody was there. So as I was contacted by the mayor to come in and help, our organization stepped up. We went immediately, and what we did was we cooked 600 burritos, the down-to-earth things that must be done to help people during emergencies. And that's how we became trusted messengers for this community, so we can get the information that we needed for the Ag Pass. And that is what allowed us. I know Carly was very surprised that we were able to interview over 1,000 farm workers in a very short period of time, because we were already trusted messengers. Okay, so I think as we move forward on this project, we interviewed over 1,011 farm workers. Okay, we got some of the very critical information that was really key to the outcomes of this survey, especially, and I know you will talk about that further, but the long-term effects on the health of farm workers, respiratory problems. Okay, I think that is critical information that we received. And I think without this engagement team, without 6 incredible community health workers, community workers, promotoras, we were able to provide this information for the survey. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Zeke. I'm going to go into some of the study findings now. Like I said, this was a really, widespread project. And so we're really just going to be covering a few of the findings here. To start out, like Zeke said, we surveyed a little over 1,000 farm workers in Sonoma County. You can see here information on where individuals lived in Sonoma County. And so we really tried to get a representative population from across the region, including those who live in more rural areas that may be less connected to services and may also be more likely to be living where agriculture is happening and where an evacuation order may go into effect. About 60% of the study participants were male, and about 42% were employed through a farm labor contractor. You can see here that the average age of the farm workers was 41 years, and they'd worked in agriculture for about 13 years. Notably, in this project, we really did not collect any identifying information. We even requested approval from the Institutional Review Board so that participants could give verbal consent rather than written consent because we really wanted to protect individuals' confidentiality and anonymity. So we didn't ask them specifically where they work or who they work for. Looking at the health impacts from this project, we found that 75% of the over 1,000 farm workers we surveyed had worked in agriculture during a wildfire in Sonoma County since 2017. Of these, about 70% experienced short-term health impacts, so things like a headache, sore throat, cough, and eye irritation. And over a third of those participants continued to experience chronic health impacts over time. We also found that almost everybody said that they were concerned about the health impacts of wildfire smoke. So I think a lot of times, we can be quick to say we need more education, we need more information about the health impacts. And we found this population knows this better than many of us. They were very aware of and concerned about these health impacts. We did find that about 64% reported receiving some sort of protective equipment from their employer if they worked during a wildfire, but notably, a lot of these were, for example, surgical masks that really don't offer protection to particulate matter. Very few participants received an N95 mask. And regardless of the type of mask, many of them had to reuse it over and over again, rather than receiving a new one each day, for example. And when we asked participants who experienced health impacts, kind of about their experiences seeking healthcare, we found that over 50% did not have health insurance. And some other really common barriers to addressing these health impacts were not being able to take off time from work to go to the doctor's office, or even if they did have health insurance, the out-of-pocket costs were still too high that for them, it just wasn't feasible to seek healthcare. And so you can see some quotes from participants here saying, they have to just quote like toughen up or use their own home remedies to address these very serious concerns. And then, as Zeke has alluded to, all of this is really so tied into economic security. And so at baseline, we found that about 3/4 of the study participants were spending between 50 and 75% of their income on rent each month. And so that really shows, that it's so impossible to save for, long-term costs. And so when we asked those who had worked during a wildfire, 58% said that they felt sick but continued to work because they couldn't afford to lose income. And 51 agreed that they felt sick but could continue to work because they were afraid of losing their job. And then we also asked participants if there were a wildfire and you couldn't work, kind of what would the economic impacts of that be? And we found that almost everybody said that it would be difficult to pay for rent. Again, we're showing, that participants are already spending most of their income on rent. And so if they lose income due to something like a wildfire, it just becomes impossible to pay for those basic needs like housing and groceries, and healthcare and gas. And you can see, again, some quotes from participants here. One said, "We bring in the money for household to pay the bills. We have to work to be able to pay the rent or else we get evicted." And someone else saying, to be honest, it's very hard to stop work, even if we were in danger because of wildfires or smoke. We still have to work. We don't have any form of income. And so again, I think this just shows that simply just providing more education and information about, for example, the health impacts of wildfires is going to be insufficient, and that there need to be kind of more systems level solutions to address these very real ties between health and economic security. And then one of the final things that I wanted to show in this presentation, again, we have a lot more findings if you're interested in looking at some of our findings more. Linda will present on some of our different products. But we also asked individuals, who would you be most comfortable interacting with to get information either about the Ag Pass or about resources and information about wildfires? And I think the findings are not so surprising. We found that most participants said they'd like to interact with community organizations or health clinics or a farm worker resource center, which does not exist in Sonoma County. Some other counties in California have these resource centers. But I think it's notable that the agencies that are the most kind of public facing for the Ag Pass and for wildfires, such as the Department of Public Health, the Department of Emergency Management, the Agricultural Commissioner's Office, and the Sheriff's Office, were not quite as trusted by farm workers. And so I think this really just underscores the need to integrate with those entities that farm workers know and trust and are willing to get information from. And then I'll hand it back over to Zeke to talk about some of our outreach after we finish the data collection. And Zeke, you're on mute.
Okay. Basically, what we did was once we concluded the surveys, it was very important that we allow that we and present the findings to our farm workers. They participated in this survey. So what we did was we held these town halls, especially in trusted locations, which was the Catholic churches, both in Cloverdale and in Santa Rosa, where some of the largest pockets of farm workers attend Mass. And we shared the outcomes, but it wasn't surprising to the farm workers because, again, as Carly alluded, it's very simple. When farm workers say, you know what, if we don't work, we don't eat. If we don't work, we don't pay the rent. It's and when we talk about rents, in 2024, there was a study by the National Coalition of Affordable Housing, and it really discusses one key point there. Factor is, what do people have to earn? What kind of wage must one earn in Sonoma County to survive in Sonoma County? And that wage is $43.61 an hour. We have farm workers earning from $16.75 an hour to $22 per hour. Many do not hit half the wages that are required to live in this county. I want you to understand why farm workers have to work during wildfires. They have no options. Okay, they're not eligible for unemployment. There's a lot of benefits that they're not entitled to, and I think that's why when we did the outreach and we wanted the information to be very specific and how wildfires impacted, that's why it's important that we have this incredible engagement team. We spoke to the Board of Supervisors, we had town halls, there were many representatives, but still, the Ag Pass, as we see it today, really does not protect farm workers from working during wildfires. Okay, there's not an effective system in place. We did additional provided services along with UC Berkeley, and we got a group of farmers together to share how to build air purifiers. We did a session in Santa Rosa and we did one in Geyserville. And it was amazing how the farm workers all stepped up. We couldn't get enough material to continue. They want these continued sessions on how to build our own air purifiers because the conditions in which farm workers live, okay, many do not have any kind of air conditioning systems to purify the air. Okay, they live in garages, they live in shacks, they live in places that are really not decent housing, let's just say. Okay, and so that's what we're doing. So what we're continuing to do is developing videos for our farm workers on where to obtain services to protect themselves. But Carly, I want to really discuss, and maybe it's later on the slide, why it's important that we involve the federally qualified health clinics. There's rural clinics in Sonoma County that do an incredible job. Alliance Medical Center. I was on the board of directors for many years. And there they have 12,000 patients. Of those 12,000 patients, about 65% are farm workers. Why are we involving these rural clinics in protecting farm workers during wildfires? That's a whole nother arena we can get into discussion. But I think there's just a lot of there's a lot of needs we have to address to really protect farm workers during wildfires. Thank you.
So as I think Zeke is illustrating, there were a lot of our findings that really touch on so many different aspects of our analysis into health, safety, economic security, and data privacy, and all the different impacts on farm workers that the survey really highlighted. And a more thorough discussion can be found in the papers that have come out of this work. So we have published a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Agromedicine, which really gets into the survey methods and findings and health recommendations related to the Ag Pass and more broadly for farm worker needs, to address farm worker needs. And then we have also published a white paper, and this applies the survey findings to policy recommendations and also provides a much more extensive analysis of how this program functions and really situates it within the state laws and oversight that is relevant to regulating work inside evacuation zones and the role of different health and safety officers and divisions, as well as the sheriff's authority in the county. And this also is where all of our recommendations on all 4 areas of the research can be found as well if you're interested in learning more about the safety or data privacy or other parts of our work that we're not discussing today as much. And then there's also the data dashboard, which is another way that we've presented the survey findings and through graphs and charts and images. That is a different way to access, again, the survey results with over 1,000 farm workers. And then I'm just going to briefly touch on some of our general recommendations, recognizing that a lot of our survey results were applicable both generally to farm worker conditions, but also then specifically perhaps become more acute under the Ag Pass and under this program, which potentially authorizes them to re-enter an evacuation zone. And so first, one of our general recommendations was to ensure that the meetings related to the Ag Pass, when this program criteria and changes were discussed, were available and advertised to farm workers and held at times that workers can attend, and allowed anonymous comments to help facilitate more worker participation. And this comes after recognizing that the Board of Supervisors meeting, where it was announced that the program would include harvesting, had not provided notice that the Ag Pass was going to be discussed and that these changes were going to be made. And this is a program which has garnered a lot of attention from different interest groups in the county. And so it's important that folks be given notice to be able to participate. And then we've also, based on strong recommendations in the survey findings, recommended removing the role of law enforcement in the Ag Pass data collection and storage. And this comes from both recognizing that the Ag Commissioner is the one who is reviewing the applications, and the Sheriff's Office, particularly right now, is not among the most trusted in the county, and creates an added layer of tension and uncertainty for a farm worker to have to go into the sheriff's office in person to receive their pass and interact with the sheriff's deputies. And there's no recognized reason for them to be the ones that are holding the information. And then we'll get into these a little bit more under health, but we really want to emphasize generally it's important that health conditions be part of the decision to activate the Ag Pass, that safety alone is not enough. And when there is no one with health expertise consulted, if it is in fact healthy inside that area, that is concerning. And also to formally recognize that Cal OSHA should have primary enforcement authority inside the evacuation zone. And this gets into our state recs a little more discussed in our publications, but really believing in the need for Cal OSHA to provide more oversight and be more present to enforce health and safety regs and evacuations. And then generally, speaking to the gaps in information and education and the need for trusted messengers, as Carly and Zeke have both highlighted, the need to provide information in accessible languages relating to where to go during an evacuation, more information generally about the wildfire smoke standards, resources for wage replacement if it is available to a worker, understanding that they may have an alternative option. And then the safety kits with PPE, the locations of health clinics, including all this information is relevant to the decision to work inside an evacuation zone or not and receive an Ag Pass, pairing the information at that time, rather than seeing the Ag Pass as an isolated program disconnected from all of these necessary services.
And then Zeke, you're on for the economic recommendations. And you're on mute.
I think what needs to be addressed here is that there's loss of income during the wildfires, and there's no mechanism in place for helping support the families and during after wildfires, and they're not eligible for unemployment. There's no hazard pay. There's no protections of income. And I think that is what's critical here, because if we look at the pattern in the history of wildfires in Sonoma County, our farm workers do not recover from one fire when the next one is already here. No, we had the 217 fire, the 219 fire, the 220 fire, okay? And it's one economic impact after another. And the farm workers never have an opportunity to recover from those. So I think something has to be in place to when there is a wildfire, okay, what mechanism are we going to have to sustain our families who are so essential to our wine industry, okay, when this occurs, okay? And another thing that I think that it hasn't been touched on, but I want to share with you what a farm worker told me, okay? He goes, and I'll say it in English. He goes, Ezekiel, why don't we just use common sense? Why don't they just give us all our protective gear before we get into a wildfire season? Why do we have to be chasing down masks, okay, when the wildfire's here, and we're in the middle of a fire? If we all got 10 masks ahead of time, we can all be protected for 10 days. It's all about using some common sense when it comes to protecting our essential workers. I think another thing that's really important, and a vast majority, they say anywhere from 75 to 85% of our immigrant community are not eligible for unemployment insurance. Although they pay into it, they're not eligible. Okay, there's just something unjust about them. You put your money so you can be protected, but you're not protected. There's something that doesn't make sense. Okay, so I think we have to look at how to create a program that farm workers will be eligible for unemployment during the wildfires. How can we develop a system of disaster pay where we know that we can protect them and they can have a means to pay their rent and feed their families? And that's what we need to do. Okay, we just need to use a little bit of common sense around this. Okay, thank you.
And then I'll touch on some of our recommendations we have for health. And so Linda kind of touched on this earlier, but right now, when the Ag Pass is activated, it's really under the sole discretion of the sheriff. And so one of our recommendations is to include a health officer or somebody from the Department of Public Health that's monitoring air quality levels and heat levels inside and near the evacuation zone to help advise on when and where and for how long to activate the Ag Pass. And one thing we mentioned here is that potentially there could be different criteria for owners or operators who are trying to go back in and, rescue livestock or turn on irrigation to save their crops versus for kind of workers who might be going back in for longer periods of time for more time and energy intensive activities like harvesting crops. I think one thing we'd like to be clear with here also is we heard from a lot of small, operators and also livestock owners and other owner operators that the Ag Pass and Livestock Pass programs are very important for their livelihood and their well-being. And so we are not saying that this program should not exist, but I think one of our fundamental findings from this project is that it was really developed to meet the needs of owners and operators and kind of expanded to include workers without potentially really thinking about all of the health and safety implications for them. Another recommendation we have is to increase air monitors across Sonoma County, especially in more rural areas, to be able to monitor real-time air quality levels. One of the biggest recommendations is to provide resources to those trusted entities. So the local community-based organizations, the health clinics, including the federally qualified clinics Zeke mentioned, and organizations such as Sonoma County Organizations Active in Disaster to develop and distribute resources and wildfire health and safety training and that, the PPE, the N95s, et cetera. In our project, our community engagement team did talk with a few H2A workers about whether or not they would be willing to participate in the project. And even though we were not collecting any identifying information, there was not a single H2A worker who felt comfortable taking the survey because they were afraid of retaliation from employers. And so we think it's really important to look at the needs of this specific population moving forward, especially as they are dependent on their employers for both housing and transportation, which has a lot of implications during evacuation zones. And further, we also think it's really important to look at the needs of populations such as those who speak Indigenous languages, as the majority of materials about wildfire health and safety and emergency notifications are really only available in English and Spanish. And then at the state level, we also recommend that Cal OSHA include greater health protective measures in their forthcoming updates to the wildfire smoke standard. Right now, the standard really just covers AQI levels in which protective gear must be provided by employers and levels at which the gear must be worn, but doesn't really include any information about things such as thresholds in which outdoor activities should be limited without kind of other engineering or administrative controls. So really want to thank everybody who participated in this project. Zeke led this local community engagement team. We also had a really fantastic group of UC Berkeley students who have experience living and working in agricultural regions, both in Sonoma County and across California. And everybody was really pivotal to this project. And then I did include our contact information here, and we left quite a bit of time for question and answer and discussion. So look forward to seeing, what questions you all have.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Zeke and Linda. This was an incredible presentation, a lot of information. So I appreciate just everything that you all have done to put this study together and engage this many farm workers in the process. We have a number of questions. I'm going to go out of order since we just heard the policy recommendations that you all have put together. One of the questions asks, what kind of responses are you all getting from policymakers and farmers, maybe farm owners and farm workers, in response to your findings and the recommendations?
I could do state and policy first and then pass it off to Zeke and Carly. But I think in terms of policymakers, I think something important to recognize is when we first started this research, a lot of policymakers and folks in the Labor Commissioner's Office, Kalusha, had no idea what the Ag Pass was, or that these programs were being created authorizing work inside of evacuation zones. And there was this big disconnect, I think, in how policies were evolving, how even the livestock pass program was able to get passed without any labor analysis of how it would impact workers and the enforcement of work laws inside of evacuation zones. So it's been a lot of education and talking with folks, a lot of, I think, surprise and concern that folks have had. And then too, I think a lot of folks recognizing that, these past programs were created to address an immediate necessity and need that urgent need people have. And so trying to think through, like, how do we reshape these, create new conditions or criteria so that they don't further put anyone in danger, but are still responsive to the emergency that's unfolding. And so I think that that's something that we're hoping to see more discussion of folks, especially in Kalusha and other agencies, stepping up and issuing a formal position on these programs and issuing instructions for how to enforce health and safety requirements inside of an evacuation zone.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Did anyone else want to jump in with other levels of government or other responses that you all have received? I think one of the questions also asks, how do farm owners feel about the Ag Pass program? Any insights from your work on how farm owners are feeling?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And we did try to engage with some kind of employers and industry-facing representatives. We did have a trickier time getting input from those stakeholders. And I think it's important to recognize that this has been an extremely contentious program. And I think there was some warranted hesitation from, researchers from Berkeley asking questions. And I think some potential fear that, we were trying to come in and get rid of the program, for example. Zeke and I have talked with a few employers, kind of not through an official research process, but a little bit more anecdotally, who have mentioned that the program has, again, been very, very essential for them. I think the question is just what it perhaps means for the health and safety of farm workers. And I think something else that's really important to acknowledge is that the massive destructive wildfires that a lot of us remember from kind of 2017 to 2020 were all before this formal version of the Ag Pass was adopted by the Board of Supervisors. And so this version of the program actually was really only activated once for a relatively small fire called the Point Fire. And it was primarily kind of owners and operators that were re-entering the evacuation zone. So we really haven't actually seen this program in practice at a large scale and kind of what it could mean for farm workers.
And also, I just want to chime in here. I think people misunderstood what we were trying to do through the Ag Pass because, the farm workers understand that the grapes need to be harvested and they need picked. They need to be picked. And I think they need it because they need the income. And I think, the farm workers and the growers are not at odds on this program. What we are trying to do is, the grapes need to be harvested. How can we set up a program that we protect the health of farm workers while they are harvesting the grapes? The grape industry is very important to Sonoma County, and we understand that. They are very. I've spoken to growers. I know a lot of growers in the Dry Creek Valley and Hillsburg. They said, "Yes, Zeke, we are very concerned about the workers." But I think they need more support from policymakers on how to implement the program, how to develop an early intervention program where we're not waiting until there's a fire, but we're very proactive in setting up systems in place. So when the wildfire is here, the growers are protected, the farm workers are protected, everybody in general is protected. And I think that's what we're looking to do. And we're hoping is an outcome of what this study is doing and what we'd like to have done.
Thank you, Zeke and Carly. And yes, that is a great reminder that this program has been put in place after some of the major wildfires that we saw in that area. We do have a question written in Spanish. I'm wondering, Zeke, are you able to actually maybe read that question and provide an answer to it in English, and we'll have our Spanish interpreters.
Would I look under the chat for that?
Yeah, there's a individual who commented that they have worked as a farm worker for 20 years in grapes and strawberries, and
I
that,
see it.
yeah, that they never received masks and that they don't have rights, if they don't feel well, there's not information for them. They feel that the employers don't care about them, and that the fires do really affect them. And kind of what's most important to the employer sometimes is like harvesting the produce.
Okay. I see it. If you don't mind, I'll respond both in Spanish and in English. Would that be okay?
I think we
Or
can
how?
do just English, Zeke, and the
Okay.
interpreters in Spanish will be able to speak it in. Yeah, thank you.
This is a good example of, how many farm workers feel and understand they were not protected during wildfires. Okay. I'm glad this person who stepped up is really sharing, and that's the voice that needs to be heard. Okay. I thank this individual for doing that, but that also um, lets us know that we have a lot of work to do. Okay, we're going to have more wildfires, and we need to protect individuals like this gentleman or this woman who wrote this comment because there is nothing in place. We have nothing. I believe this is just in general that I don't think we have anything in place to protect a vast majority of our farm workers. We don't have that in place right now. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Zeke. It looks like we have a few questions related to what other counties are doing. So do you all have a sense? I know your focus for this study was Sonoma, but do you have a sense of what other counties are doing? Are there other ag passes activated or developed? And is there also looking like interest in expanding beyond just livestock and into agricultural work as well?
Linda, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So there are several other counties that have ag pass programs and livestock pass programs. So I would say at the outset in 2023, when we were looking at these programs, there were at least a dozen others and several others that were in the process of creating their programs. So I'm sure that number has gone up. Some of the counties have different, I think what's worth noting is counties have different criteria. So some only allow owners and managers, whereas some include like Sonoma full-time employees. When we were doing this work, Sonoma and Napa were among the only ones allowing employees to re-enter, and specifically including harvesting as an authorized activity. Several counties did not allow harvesting. But it really has been kind of evolving county by county. It is a patchwork of criteria and programs, especially for ag passes, because there is no state direction on ag passes. So I think it's important to look specifically at your county if you're trying to understand who is eligible for a pass and who can, and the terms in which they can re-enter the evacuation zone.
For the graduate students who might be tuning in, I feel like I'm hearing a lot of opportunity for potential capstone projects. There's a lot of questions remaining and further evaluation to be done. Thank you, Linda, for answering that question. We have some more questions related to the role of the sheriff's office being the one who decides on activation and access, as well as a question related to that and how immigration status informs farm workers' decisions to work during wildfires, and the added layer that interfacing with law enforcement during that time may add. Can any of you comment on that, on those questions, please?
Yeah, for the sheriff piece, the sheriff's responsibility, that is coming from state law and the way that evacuation zones are set up, that they declare the state of emergency and are the ones in Sonoma County that are overseeing who's going. Sometimes they're working with mutual aid partners, so it might not be the sheriff themselves there, but they're dictating who's going to be where, when, and enforcing the evacuation order. And the county specifically has delegated the sheriff authority to run the Ag Pass. So they don't have to run the Ag Pass. Other counties have other offices running their Ag Pass programs, but that authority is specifically coming from the Board of Supervisors that decided the sheriff would run it.
And
In relation to the farm workers, put yourself in their shoes. You know, you're asked to go to the sheriff's department to get fingerprinted, give all the information as to where you reside, you know, and given your status in this country, are we really going to want to give up that information? You know, that just and the answer is no. Okay. So they're in a situation where they want to be protected, they want to go through a program, but there's risks of giving up your ID and information. You know, talk about immigration, ICE. I mean, that's the situation they find themselves in. So you have to put you have to put yourself in their shoes to understand what the dilemma is here and what the barrier is for them. Thank you.
And I'll just say super briefly, I know we're about at time, that we conducted this full study before the 2024 presidential election. And so we imagined that any fear or hesitation of interacting both with the sheriff's office and government agencies would only be amplified many times over under the current federal administration.
Thank you, Carly. We are unfortunately at time, so we can't answer the remaining questions. I wanted to thank everyone who tuned into today's webinar, as well as to thank the panelists, Zeke, Carly, and Linda, and finally our interpreters as well, who were graciously interpreting as we spoke very rapidly through our slides. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.